The year 2007 is the year of the subprimes crisis, and that opens a world economic crisis worse than anything that we've seen since 1945, and that plays out through 2008, 2009, 2010 and beyond in the developed world, but notably also in the EU, and it has very serious consequences for the way the EU is seen. At the same time, and more recently, there are two other crises that open up linked to the EU's relationship with neighbouring states. One of them, of course, is Vladimir Putin's Russia and the challenge he poses towards, in particular, the Ukraine, a state that had been seen to be leaning towards the EU, and where the Russians first annexed the Crimea and then quite clearly helped provoke a civil war with the aim of establishing the autonomy of Russian-speaking areas to the east. The second crisis was the refugee crisis, very much linked to the Arab Spring, which opened up in 2011. The EU has reacted to both of these crises with a degree of effectiveness which, let us say, leaves something to be desired. Certainly it can be argued the EU has kept up a dialogue with Vladimir Putin, perhaps showed him a few red lines, perhaps limited the degree of Russian expansionism, although others might argue that actually they provoked him by trying to draw the Ukraine into the EU ambit in the first place. Towards the refugee crisis, the EU, which every day faces boatloads of people fleeing political persecution across the Mediterranean in makeshift boats, has been similarly ineffective. Do we divvy out refugees between member states, as Jean-Claude Juncker attempted to suggest, without a very favourable response from the member states? Do we try and stop them even by destroying boats in Libya? Do we welcome them, as Angela Merkel unilaterally suggested and attempted to implement in relation to Germany? There has not yet emerged a consensus response on how to respond to the refugee crisis. This isn't entirely the fault of the EU. After all, if the member states agreed, then the EU would certainly be able and happy to implement what the member states decided. But the EU has not engaged sufficiently in its traditional role of consensus former on these issues. But perhaps of more immediate concern is the economic crisis, and more specifically the euro crisis. The euro might have been in difficulties anyway, because although member states of the EU, like states just about everywhere across the world, initially responded to the subprimes crisis by spending more, by printing money, by going into debt, policies which in the short term were successful and necessary in preventing a recession from turning into a full-blown 1930s depression. By 2010, the European Central Bank is trying to rein back member states from excessive spending, trying to bring them back to the tighter deficit targets, the tighter debt targets that have been set and agreed as the price of joining the euro. So that in any case, probably, Europe would have been even more associated with austerity from 2010 than it had been before. However, in addition to that, it is clear that because the euro was seen as such a solid currency by the international money markets, a certain number of companies and governments had benefited from this very strong baseline to over-borrow. The four countries most chiefly concerned were the so-called pigs, that is, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain, to which we might possibly add Italy. Italy's problems contained, but only for the moment. Now, if the private sector was very important in the over-borrowing process, notably in Ireland and Spain and Portugal, in Greece it's very much the state which is out there on a limb. It's pretty clear that the Greeks were allowed to cook their books in joining the euro in the first place, that they were allowed in for largely political reasons, birthplace of democracy and all that, and that they had, particularly in the wake of their own Olympic Games, vastly over-borrowed and had no very clear way to repay their debts. Within this rather gloomy perspective, several perspectives emerged between Germany, very important in relation to the European Central Bank, the European Central Bank itself, the International Monetary Fund, other European member states. Roughly speaking, one perspective was the hard German one. The Greeks had borrowed the money, they should jolly well be made to repay it at the limit, a little behind schedule, but in full. On the other hand, there are softer perspectives saying, look, it isn't realistic to ask the Greeks to go through years of very much worse than austerity to repay debts that in practice they will never manage to give back. The Greeks should be given the chance to write off at least a part of their debt. And that crisis rumbles on. It's by no means settled as yet. This poses the even broader question of, well, what sort of Europe should we be going for if the single currency has proved in this crisis so dysfunctional? Should we not, as the sceptics towards the whole euro project had initially said, should the eurozone not actually be much more tightly controlled, much more centrally controlled, in order to keep the spending policies, the fiscal policies of member states in line with what it seemed as good practice? In other words, a loss of sovereignty by the member states of the eurozone. It is in the context of these three interlocking crises, inadequacy of foreign policy in the East, impotence in dealing with the refugee problem, and the euro crisis, that David Cameron calls his referendum in 2015. The EU, at this point and into 2016, is rarely at a low political level, at a low point in its popularity, right across the member states, a lower point probably than at any since the Treaty of Rome. That is the unhappy context in which the Brexit referendum was caused, and although there are many specifically British reasons to explain the result of the referendum, I don't think you can explain it without that broader European context.